Are we ready?
Tak, dobrý večer.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the documentary film. I am in Ji.hlava and I am here to host this year's only documentary dialogue organized in the framework of the Inspiration Forum, whose objective is to inspire towards new modes of thinking about today's world. And it aims both directors, authors, but also the general public. The aim is to get out of our box, think out of box, and get a fresh look on our creation. That is why we do not discuss with directors or dramaturgists. We like to discuss with experts from related fields who I think can help us find new ways of creating films, shooting documentary films, and reflecting upon them. First, I should like to say that you can watch this debate via Facebook of the festival or the Facebook account of the Institute of Documentary Films, and you can also see it at YouTube. So, good evening again to the Czech Republic, the whole world, and good evening also goes to California, which goes through the election night today, where the future of the United States under Trump's administration or Biden's administration is going to be decided. I would like to welcome Professor of the CIIS University in San Francisco, anthropologist and modern anarchist, Andrej Grubačić. Welcome, good evening, or good afternoon, California.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm really pleased to be here on the election night because it is a topic which will be touched upon in our dialogue. You, in your work, combine your experience with the East and Western world. You spent your childhood in the defragmented Yugoslavia. After your short work at the university in Belgrade, you emigrated, and now you have lived in the United States. You are a prolific author, scholar, cooperate with prominent figures in the field too. When we met virtually and talked about today's discussion, you suggested we could think about emigration, which can be perceived as a loss, but in your perception, it can be also thought of as a creative process. So we can think about how emigration can be inspirative. First question, tell me, what was your first emigration? When you were a child, probably the first emigration consists in running away from one's family, the background. So what was your first emigration?
It's interesting, you know, I never had that kind of immigrant experience in relation to my family. Family in my world was this continuity between generations, and I was very proud of continuing the tradition of my family, which were communist and anti-fascist for generations. And it was becoming increasingly unpopular to be identified with that tradition in the 80s and in the 90s in what was then Yugoslavia, because of the nationalist resurgence, recrudescence of the worst kinds of nationalism, ethnic nationalism. So my family actually wasn't a place that in many ways, that was a place where I stayed. The place where I emigrated to, or what I often refer to as my first exile, is the time of the demise of Yugoslavia. So Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and of course scholars still quibble about the exact date of its demise. But for me, it was being a child. Well, I wasn't exactly a child. Being a young adult, watching the siege of Sarajevo, the very beginning of the siege of Sarajevo. And Sarajevo is the place where most of my family comes from. And there were helicopters and people were escaping, and there were already guns, and there were already grenades, and there was already the sounds of violence were everywhere, and I was receiving them through TV, and I remember just tears that would not stop. I couldn't stop myself from crying, and I think I cried probably for a day. And that was the, symbolically speaking, but also very viscerally, very somatically, I still remember those noises, still remember those sounds. These were the sounds, the background noise of my first exile, of the loss of the country that, despite all of its flaws, is something that I have believed in, and in a certain sense that I still do, but also a country that my family helped build from before the revolution of 1940s. And all of my family members were members of the Communist Party, even of the Central Committee of the Yugoslav Communist Party. They were all revolutionaries. They were all in prisons, the so-called Red Universities. I don't need to tell you more about this history because you have your own that is very similar. But that particular kind of intransigence, stubbornness, belief in the possibility of revolution, of change, is something that marked not only my exile, meaning the demise of Yugoslavia, my first exile, but also the conviction that exile can lead, which I think is what you are asking, lead to a certain kind of reinvention. It certainly helped me reinvent myself. And one of the things that I remember in times of that first exile is a conversation that I had with my paternal grandmother. And that conversation was really interesting. She was a remarkable woman, and she would give me to read these books when I was 12. And the books were Feuerbach. And it was impossible to read them, and she was terrified that I'm going to become an idealist. She wanted to prevent that, and she wanted to make me a materialist, so she would give me Feuerbach. And exhausted because I couldn't understand a single word at the age of 12 of Feuerbach, I asked her, well, Grandma, you're still a communist, despite everything that is happening. And that was the 80s, the time of large indebtedness of Yugoslavia. The signs were already there. And she said something that marked me for the rest of my life. She said, I will always be a communist. But my generation did make one mistake. They looked for a wrong path of actually arriving at communism. The task of your generation is to find a different path, to find a different way. And ever since, in the forthcoming years, I was actually struggling to find that different path to communism. And that's where my other grandmother comes in. And my maternal grandmother gave me a book by Alexander Ivanovich Herzen. It's a beautiful book that in English, I think it translates as My Past and Thoughts. And it contained one anecdote. Namely, there was a Russian aristocrat who became an anarchist, the name of Mikhail Bakunin. He was chained to the wall in prison in Siberia, forced to repent for his ideological sins by the emperor himself. He was chained to the wall. Somehow he was able to escape, nobody really knows how, to swim across the frozen river Volga, get to the near ship, get from there to this incredible journey to Caribbean, to United States, and finally to England, where Herzen was waiting for him. And Herzen describes this moment when Bakunin disembarks the ship, and says, or asks rather, Herzen, do they have oysters in England, or do I need to go back to Siberia? And I was just in love. It was one of those moments of complete, when you feel captivated by a book, by a line that you read. You can't really understand why, but I fell in love with these romantic exiles of the 19th centuries. And I also discovered the ideas of anarchism. And anarchism as this distinct form of socialism, which is more than anything else an ethics of practice, which was submerged or even removed, but definitely hidden from the curriculum of invisible and visible curriculum of our schools back in socialist Yugoslavia, showed me that there is another way of thinking about socialism and different way of thinking about communism. I later reframed my grandmother's question, and I started thinking about not arriving at communism, but at different ways of organizing communism. And this is something that, of course, we can talk about. But this, my whole world after the first exile, the exile of the demise of Yugoslavia, was one of frantic search for something new, to understand what went wrong with Yugoslavia, to be able to see that Yugoslavia, despite its absolutely beautiful and magnificent tradition, Yugoslavia is an idea, it's not a thing, it's not a country, it's more of a myth and idea and a project that remains open and unfinished. But I was able to see that there was a problem. There was a problem with the political form, which was the state. There was another problem, which was the problem of nationalism. And all of my political and scholarly career, academic career ever since, was about trying to find ways of going beyond nationalism and going beyond the idea of nation state. So that is what I think defined my exilic experience. And, in a certain sense, exile led to a reinvention that for me was very important.
Speaking to our viewers, I would like to say that speaking about your family, your grandfather was a partisan, and then he was a major figure in Yugoslavia. In the 70s, he was the president of the Yugoslavian Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And as you said, your father studies Kafka with deep devotion, and both for your grandfather and your father, Prague has played an important role. One of them was sent to Prague to university, so received his education in Prague, and then spread it in his home country. And you come from a family of intellectuals, a family who is interested in what happens in the world, in the events. You are interested in political aspects of the world, and you also try to stand on the earth, be realistic, be in touch with what is happening around and react and maybe influence it. I would like to know about this idea brought up by your grandmother. How did you develop it? Because you are not only a reader, only a scholar, you are also a researcher, and you have a life experience which brought you to work, to Syria, to Rojava, where you taught at the local university. You're still in touch with the local intellectuals, and you are probably more aware of the situation there than we here. So this experience, how and your studies of the practical models and alternative ways of organizing the society, how did this influence your view of what your granny has said to you?
It's a beautiful question, and it's a lot to think about. to begin with, interesting thing that I probably have not told you is that the grandfather who was in Prague and who got his PhD in Prague before the Second World War and became really a communist in Prague, so that's where he got infected with those dangerous ideas at the time. That was my father's father, my paternal grandfather, and he was also a very important figure. However, he did get into trouble. Namely, he was considered to be one of the most educated Marxists of his day. He was the president of the liberated zone, that was autonomous zone that was created during the Second World War by Yugoslav partisans. There was a university, and he was the first rector, the first president of the university. However, after the war, he became a minister of education, not a position that's easy to have, so he became a prisoner. Soon thereafter, he was taken to the only gulag that Yugoslavs had. In Yugoslavia, Stalinists would go to a gulag, and Titoists were in power. My other maternal grandfather, who became the president of Bosnia and vice president and the president of presidency of Yugoslav Federation later on, that was my mother's father. And in a certain sense, while he was in power, my other grandfather was in prison, tortured, and he died of the consequences of torture by his fellow comrades in 1958. So soon after he was actually released from the place that was called Goli Otok, Naked Island, an island in the Adriatic Sea. So, all of this, I'm telling you all of this because it embodies the contradictions of a political position. My family was absolutely terrified of me becoming political, and as I told you, I became political in a revolutionary sense very early on, because there was some real serious experience that one had to pay. Another anecdote that I don't know if I shared with you, but it was very important for my mother, was when my grandfather, so the Titoist, he told her and her two sisters that his family, it's not really his children. His family and his primary allegiance is the Communist Party. And the Yugoslav Communist Party is his family. The children are sort of secondary. My mother never really recovered from this. And that was an important moment for me in rethinking my grandmother's advice, that any kind of communism, any kind of alternative vision of politics, radical politics, revolutionary politics that I would endorse, would have to actually begin with those people who are closest to us. You cannot really change the world without changing the way or modeling it on the basis of your most intimate relationships. And this is what I think pushed me towards anarchism, which I always understood as taking democracy very seriously, but more than anything else, organizing in a way that during the Occupy days and anti-globalization movement days, we used to call prefiguratively. So you organize in a way, you in a certain sense embody the world and relationships that you would like to see in the world. And in that sense, there is a certain identity of means and ends. You cannot create freedom through authoritarian means. You, again, have to embody it in the way that you organize in the here and now. As Spanish revolutionaries said in the 1930s, you have to build the facts of the future right now. In the immediate present. And that is something that took me to Kropotkin. Pyotr Kropotkin, the Russian, you mentioned Kafka, Kafka's diaries, you have one page that's really revealing in which he says, "Remember Kropotkin!" exclamation point. And Kropotkin was this Russian naturalist, geographer, traveler, anarchist, an incredible figure. He was a prince who became an anarchist. And he defined what, for anybody who is interested in libertarian socialist tradition, is one of the most important books and concepts, and that is Mutual Aid, which he published in 1902. And in that book, most of in those ideas, and actually, Philip, this is the last thing that I wrote with my now late friend David Graeber, one of the most amazing anthropologists and most amazing anarchists, who is, I'm sure, translated into Czech, who unfortunately died prematurely this summer. One of the last things that I wrote that's going to be published right now is introduction, together with David, to the book Mutual Aid. This is the 100 and however many years after its release, to Peter Kropotkin's Mutual Aid. So the travails and the adventures and journeys that led me from my home at that moment when I was feeling the exile, the loss of Yugoslavia, took me to many different places. My second exile was really leaving the territory of the former Yugoslavia, right? And leaving it as a Yugoslav, because I very stubbornly remained a Yugoslav. I refused any other identity. I was educated as a Yugoslav, I was raised as a Yugoslav, and I always felt, and I never really have seen any reason to change that part of myself, because it is something that to me is very important. But the things that I told you at the very beginning, things that troubled me about Yugoslavia, things that complicated my grandmother's advice, were problems of nationalism and problems of the state. And of course, the particular and peculiar way that what Philip Dick called this malign abstractness of the state actually combines with capitalism. So, and what kind of identities this particularly obnoxious fusion produces. So I was very early on interested in those experiences in which new identities are being formed, forming and forging new collective identities that refuse and resist in this insurgent way the logic of the nation state. The logic of nationalism and identitarian thinking became something that completely, in a certain sense, shaped my political and academic life. Took me to the jungles of Mexico, where a group called themselves the Zapatistas of Chiapas, southern Mexico, were creating since 1994 an incredibly exciting experiment of communal life, which was based exactly on those ideas that my mother was appalled. My mother was appalled by this idea that you can create a world in which your family is going to disappear.
Když jsem o tom poprávil své matce, tak tu zhrozil ten způsob, ve kterým fungují tyto zapatisté.
Tady nám nefungoval zvuk a můžeme pokračovat dál.
We couldn't hear interpreters, but we can go on now.
Okay, so going to the Zapatistas, to the jungle of Mexico, and discovering this new world of attempt to actually create different identities, not ones defined by nation states, but insurgent collective identities that went beyond nationalism, that went beyond state. And that became a focal point of my research, but also very much influenced my politics. And, I was never really able to divide the two. To me, they kind of were seamlessly connected. I never had or felt the need to distinguish them in any meaningful way. So I followed the Zapatistas, followed those remarkable experiences. Of course, we can talk more about this if you're interested. And after that, I decided to study something slightly similar, but also extremely different.
Exactly, that would really interest me. If you could mention a specific story when you met the Zapatist movement and when you got to know how they live, because this community is really surrounded by mystery. We really don't know this in depth. So could you maybe bring it closer?
I will definitely try. When you are very immersed into studying something, it's always very hard to take that step back, that distance, and to try to simplify and to explain to people who are new to a particular topic. And that kind of particular emotional shock and surprise when in the middle of everything that was happening in Yugoslavia, which was under bombs at the time, I was a member of a group that called themselves Belgrade Libertarian Group. And this particular group, which was illegal during the days of Tito, and even, I guess, more illegal during the days, or illegal but irrelevant in times that after the breakup of Yugoslavia, or during the breakup of Yugoslavia. But we organized interesting things. We, in very difficult conditions, we would do things like organize films. And there was one film in particular that completely caught my attention. It was about this group in Chiapas, in Mexico. They were all masked. There was this incredibly interesting figure called Subcomandante Marcos. Since then, he changed his name, who, in a certain sense, embodied the kind of new collective idea of what it means to resist. That was the beginning of the anti-globalization movement. There was this man with a pipe reading something that was probably influenced by Marxist philosopher Althusser, but in this beautiful poetic way that is extremely, and as a budding anthropologist, I was able to recognize some of the indigenous elements of indigenous Mayan cosmology. And it was nothing I've ever heard. I was attracted to surrealist movement very early on, and I was very open and very curious about this particular amalgamations. But this kind of poetry and this kind of truly marvelous way of intervening in a political life hit me like a ton of bricks, as they say here in the United States. And I became very interested and curious about the Mexican Zapatista guerrilla movement that was at the beginning extremely Maoist, extremely old-fashioned, extremely what we would call Marxist-Leninist. It represented everything that is part of the so-called old left, bureaucratic left, the kind of boring left that we had to deal with in former so-called socialist states. So that was really interesting, and that a group like this of Maoists who were prosecuted by government and went to Chiapas, so a very remote part near the border with Guatemala, remote part of Mexico. They went there basically seeking refuge. What I have discovered was the world of indigenous cosmology, indigenous habits, indigenous ways of life. They discovered a past that was very much part of the present. And that completely transformed them. They were open enough to transform their very clunky, old-fashioned Maoism and to actually accompany these indigenous who were, again, at the same time, probably the least alienated but most oppressed people that you can find in Mexico. And they changed. They transformed themselves from a Maoist guerrilla into a completely new, different formation that created new identities, a new kind of politics based on direct democracy, based on very direct communism, and relationships that in many ways affirmed the values, the indigenous values of pre-capitalist life. And they created something of an explosion in the world, because this was when they announced the rebellion against what was called NAFTA, the trade agreement that was imposed by the US-American government. The new movement was being born, and that movement became known as anti-globalization movement, global justice movement, and I know that in the Czech Republic there are many scholars and many activists who actually studied those movements. And one of my first experiences in Prague was to actually be arrested in one of the demonstrations, early demonstrations. I think it was against IMF, International Monetary Fund, during the 2001, perhaps it was. It was a magnificent demonstration in Prague that kind of showcased all the colorfulness of the new politics that anti-globalization movement, inspired by Zapatistas, this very obscure group, right? Former Maoist guerrillas, now remade into this indigenous identity-refusing formation in Mexico. The new politics that they have inspired and the new movement that they have initiated, which is the anti-globalization movement with its both social forums and its people's global actions, to my mind, led directly to those later experiences like the Occupy movement, the global mass assembly movement that existed from Europe all the way to Egypt, of course, and many other places. So these subterranean networks that were created there that have that initiation point in Zapatismo, in the Lacandon jungle, place that I visited and spent some time at, were extremely important. Now, of course, that is one instance, and I don't know if you're interested in learning more about the Zapatistas. I wrote several books about the Zapatistas and that early Zapatista experiences, including a book called Moblies and Zapatistas that tried to relate early American rebels to the Zapatistas, the immigrant rebel culture of early 20th century with this indigenous rebel culture of the late 20th century. But Zapatistas were one of the stations, so to speak, where I tried to, one of these exilic destinations, where I tried to look for what I became obsessed since my early days as an anarchist in Belgrade, and it is this notion of mutual aid, our ability to recreate ourselves, to create new collective identities, and to create relationships and pay attention to those relationships that are based on cooperation, solidarity, and commoning.
In this context, since you mentioned this demonstration in Prague, I would like to repeat something I already told you. When you in Prague say Marx, or when I hear you saying that in your family people were sent to Goly Otok, when you talk about Marxism, anarchism, well, these are notions that here in Central Europe have very strong connotations, emotive connotations. In the Czech Republic, especially due to our socialist history, which was really different and I think in many ways worse than in Yugoslavia. That is why the reaction towards those notions is rather negative. To me, you are an intellectual who thinks about his ideas and presentations. So maybe rethink how to explain these ideas, because today we can see the rise of extreme right ideas represented by President Trump too. So I know that your idea is probably to make provocations, but I think that your words can seem provocative to us in the Czech Republic because you just speak about them with no qualms. Though I know that your idea is not to make provocations, it's just to present ideas that we probably will agree on. Other subjects, such as the environmental change, are also touched on this. How would you translate yourself into a language understandable to a person who hates communism and lives in Central Europe?
I think hating communism and living in Central Europe makes all the sense in the world. So does in Yugoslavia in a certain sense, although I do think that you're right. Yugoslavia was a very distinct experience. And I think that it was very different as the non-aligned country that was in the middle of Europe, a non-Stalinist country that's built on the ideas of at least trying to repel bureaucracy and to restrain the Communist Party. There are many differences that I think are very important. Self-management comes to mind. all of these things make Yugoslav experience slightly different, even including the multi-ethnic substance of Yugoslavia that was called bratstvo, jedinstvo, or fraternity and solidarity, the lack of better words to translate this. But I think that your question is extremely important, because I always made the distinction between real existing socialism and real existing communism. Now, real existing socialism are all of these countries that I have no sympathy for. I have absolutely no sympathy for socialist regimes or former socialist regimes and what they called socialism, actually. As far as I remember, they never used the term communism, which was kind of interesting. They always used the term socialism, because in this linear ideas of liberal Eurocentric modernity, the idea is that you live through stages, right? There are sequences. Socialism leads you to communism. So they always felt like they're in some kind of a purgatory. They are not yet communist. They're still only socialist. But this real existing socialism, to me, is something that by all means we need to put to rest. This bureaucratic socialism has been, I believe, destroyed by the World Revolution of 1968, which probably lasted between 1965 and 1971. Prague, of course, played a Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia played a huge role in all of this, in dismantling the ideals and ideas and a certain nostalgic relationship that people had to these real existing socialist countries and bureaucratic socialism. But we should be very careful here. We should not, when we talk about mutual aid, which is, again, for anarchists, a very important concept, when we talk about everyday, we are talking about communism, we are talking about particular kind of communism, we are talking about everyday interactions, we are talking about something that we can call practical communism or everyday communism. Remember that I told you that my grandmother's phrase was to find a new way to communism? It's a particular way of thinking about communism that's slightly mythic. That's a very abstract communism. That is the idea that there was at some point in time, a place, a kind of conditions of life that we can call communism. In anthropology, it's known as primitive communism. And then through stages, we are going to, in a certain sense, go back to that state of communism. So we were moving away from communism and then coming back to it, to the modern communism. That was the promise of Marx and Engels. That was the promise of Communist Manifesto. However, what that was, and the first time the word communism was used was actually in 1837, I believe, by Leblanc. And he was talking about a particular conception of the organization of society. But Marxists haven't had any, at that time, monopoly on the notion of communism. It's a fascinating conversation. I don't know how deep you want to go into this, but communism was in those days identified with people who were creating communal experiences, communes, people whom artists and people who today would, I'm sure, rediscover with great pleasure and joy. Communism, or the so-called utopian communism of, say, Owen and many others. Later on, communism became a watchword used by non-Marxists and sometimes very openly anti-Marxist groups on the left, including, of course, the anarchists. So what they were talking about was not the mythic communism that awaits us in the future. They were talking about communism of the everyday. They were basically saying, as did Kropotkin, that communism is already here. You just need to look for it. And if you want to create a new world, you have to begin with what is already around you. And what is already around you are these building blocks of the new society. And communism in that sense, as a practical communism, as an everyday communism, unlike the kind of eschatological mythic communism, means something very different. It means the way that you are relating right now. We are having a conversation. In that conversation, we are doing something that's palpably communistic. We are exchanging ideas with the sole purpose of actually having fun and having a pleasurable experience. Communism was identified with joy, with gifts, Marcel Mauss, who is a beautiful anthropologist, French anthropologist, wrote a book that I think everybody should read, The Gift, and also his essays on ethnography, which are sort of an explanation of many of the concepts that he included there, and it works perfectly well with Kropotkin. And he was saying that what our civilization is built on is on this incredibly interesting denial of gift. We exist because of communism, of communistic relationships that are hidden in every day, relationships of gift, relationships of open-ended reciprocity, relationships of joy and pleasure, relationships of, if you want, communism of the senses. The way that we are now, that you have a film festival, that to me, and to Kropotkin, and to people who use the term communism before the Marxist monopolization of this term, actually meant coming together in this convivial way, organizing something that's ultimately pleasurable, sharing something. And that is what people meant by communism. Everyday communism is something that everybody needs, everybody loves, that is exchange of presents, of gifts. It's something that it's doing something for your, even that famous quotation that I'm sure that you or your generation had to suffer through Marxist education like mine. We were taught that communism is what? From each to their ability to each according to their need. It's actually a beautiful saying. If you think about it, that's how the world really operates. So the way that I think about everyday really existing communism as opposed to really existing socialism that doesn't exist anymore, fortunately, is I'm thinking about those everyday acts of kindness, of conviviality, of sharing, of coming together, of having a conversation, of having a meal together. And as an anthropologist, I always enjoyed seeing how much sharing food was important, as much as sharing images and films, is important in terms of actually having a decent, pleasurable, dignified life. And I do think, going back to my grandmother's notion of going to communism, it's a wrong way of thinking about it. Communism is already here. We need to learn how to organize it better. Communism, everyday acts of solidarity, of cooperation, and even this instinct of sociability is what makes life and human community possible. So what we need to do, and maybe even we can define capitalism as a bad way of organizing communism, because there is no capitalism and there is no way of organizing society without people helping each other, without people working together. And that's what communism is. So the question then is how do we organize communism in a way that is actually more efficient, more dignified, and has absolutely nothing to do with the real existing socialist tradition in Central Europe.
It is fascinating how easily you can keep using and reusing the word, speak about it with a smile, and I believe that our viewers have now completely or have different feelings about the word than you have. Maybe it is a question of the notion in the dictionary. Maybe we could discuss about the term and what it really means. There is one famous Czech actor who said, when she spoke about the communism, and she's maybe in the age of your grandmother, she said that communism is beautiful, but it is only for angels, not for people. You mentioned the word capitalism too, and there is one Czech director, Jan Gogola, who is often a guest here at our festival. When I had debates with him, he said that for him the biggest anarchist of our times is Bill Gates. And the anarchists from the past, in their conceptions, are no more up to date. Bill Gates is a person who can use capitalism in such a way to make the max, or an anarchist would be a person who could make such an use of the wealth which was obtained by capitalism so as to help others. Also, there are people who accumulate wealth within the system and then maybe try to use it in a different way, which could use to revolution, to global change. Maybe things can realize what they can achieve if they can share their wealth. Isn't this an inspiration to you? Could you approach the topic maybe from another direction? Not only hope in our solidarity, because there is also a sense of selfishness. Maybe look at it with the director Gogola's eyes. Let's look at the people who are already successful, who are already wealthy, who could share their fortune, which of course is already taking place, for example, in the US.
I love your questions and I love your ideas. I think it's very interesting the way that you complicate it and you make it also very, in a certain sense, it inspired me to think about the same point that your colleague made, but from a different perspective. He talks about Bill Gates. I would, if I were to think about communism and capitalism and their relationship, I would think, and again, everyday communism of everyday life, us helping each other, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, sort of communism embedded in the textures of the everyday. I would actually think of, what is the name of the other Apple guy? It's the, name escapes me. The whole Apple operation, Steve Jobs. The whole Apple operation is actually completely anarchistic in this communistic sense. Namely, we are looking at few people, I think there were probably 20 or 30 of them, who were working together, sort of seceding from the world of that particular age, particular orientation that they were up against, working in their garages, working in these improvised spaces, working together, collaborating. So the whole Apple thing, even though, we're kind of trained to think about this, there's even a very beautiful biography that I learned a lot from of Steve Jobs, recently published. We basically learned that this is an idea of a genius coming out of the head of a genius, a solitary experience of enlightenment that created this whole empire. Well, actually it isn't. It has very communistic origins of a group of young people who are coming together, working in this underground, semi-underground spaces and collaborating together. And in this sense, I do think that capitalism is, and this would be how I would turn this argument on its head, that capitalism is parasitic of communism. There is no capitalism without communism. There is no way that capitalism can actually exist without cooperation, without mutual trust, and without the ways that people organize in the everyday. Communism, however, or any kind of alternative design of society can exist without capitalism. And that is a very important point. So I think when I say that we need to figure out the ways of organizing this energy of mutual aid, of cooperation, and all of those words that I'm using, that everyday kindness. And anarchist for me, is nothing more than a sort of insurgent common sense, idea of kindness, generosity, and selflessness transformed into a political organization. Is it only the angels who can actually inhabit that space and that new world of that anarchists, including many people from Czech Republic who comes to mind? No, I don't think so. There was a beautiful quote, again, Kropotkin, who says, we are always accused of being idealists. We are always accused of emphasizing the human nature as something that is beautiful and uncorrupted and all of that. But no, anarchist carries a hatchet in the forest of prejudice because, that was his quote, because he doesn't believe that humans are ideal. Anarchists are deeply loving or accepting, perhaps, of people as they are right now, with all their flaws. But what is the worst thing that you can actually do in organizing a society? Give somebody, if you actually don't believe that this is a society of angels, and if you're actually realistic about human nature, then the worst thing that you can do is to give somebody a gun and give somebody a power to kill. So in anarchist society, which means society without bureaucracy, society without states, society built on acts of everyday kindness and economy and political organization that reflects that. You won't have people who actually have guns and who can command armies. So if you're actually serious about this argument about the angels, then the worst possible thing that you can do is to create a power structure, give them guns, and send them to war. And this is the history of every single liberal regime, and this is a history of every single Marxist regime, as you well know. So I think what the anarchists are saying is ultimately nothing more than just common sense. No, we don't believe that humans are angels, but exactly because of this, you should not give people more power over other people. You have to find alternative arrangements. And you know, the interesting thing, an interesting gambit of the anarchist approach in my science, in anthropology, in what we call anarchist anthropology, is exactly that. What we are looking at are not examples of selfishness. We are looking at the ways that people organized. And you know, you can think about anthropology in that sense as a compendium of political possibilities. As my late friend David Graeber never got tired of saying and reminding us. You can think about it as a way of looking at the alternatives, other ways of life that were hidden in opposition to, but also hidden in the interstices of dominant institutions, like seed beneath the snow. So those ideas, networks of self-organization, of self-help, of cooperation, is what anarchist anthropologists study. The idea of selfishness, the idea of Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene, I don't know if he's an absolute idiot. I don't know if he's popular in Czech Republic, but that sort of bizarre thinking is basically a response to the ideas and challenges presented by people like Kropotkin and Moss, who were saying, no, this competitive interpretation of Darwin, of this was Spencer and Huxley, his students, who were saying, yeah, it's the struggle of all against all. I said, no, this gladiatorial view of nature, which is stained with human blood, is exactly the way of thinking that we need to dispense with. And they said, when we look at human nature, when we look at nature itself, and I don't think that we can afford anymore to think about nature in the way that we did. And I think we should probably say a few words about that later. But when you look at nature and the way that we are organizing, that human and extra-human communities are organized, you see more cooperation than you see what possessive individualism. And that, I think, is a very important point. And the Huxleyan and everything else, things that we now take almost, unfortunately, as a common sense, are completely exaggerated and absolutely not scientific in any meaningful way. So we need new paradigms, we need new language, we need new ways of thinking about things. There is a wonderful historian who used the terms alternativity in history. I like that term a lot. He speaks of alternativity, and he says that we need social science that is actually sensitive to alternativity. And it's a very awkward word in English, alternativity. What he means is that the world functions in more or less well-structured patterns. But now and then, there is a moment when the alternativity of history becomes very high. If usually it is rather low, sometimes it gets very high. This is the time of paradigm shifts. This is the time when we actually have to figure out new ways, new languages, new ideas and ways of relating, and new political vistas. This is such time. We are living in what is probably a terminal crisis of capitalism. Capitalism as a civilization is we don't have a climate justice or a climate crisis. We don't have an ecological crisis. We don't have a social crisis. We have a crisis of the system that we live in. And I believe that crisis is actually terminal. And I believe that the greatest question that we have to think about today is what kind of a world we would like to live in, what kind of civilization we would like to build. Because from this point, if I'm right, and if capitalism as a system, as a civilization, as a way of organizing life, organizing production, organizing power, and also organizing nature, is actually approaching its end, what kind of system is going to be built? Is there going to be a system that's much worse than capitalism? It's entirely possible. Is there going to be a system, a civilization that's based on more reasonable and democratic and egalitarian ways? It's entirely possible, and it's up to us. And I think now is the time to ask all of those questions.
I'm happy that you mentioned the change of paradigm, languages, interpretations, notions, new language that we need, because I think today's society is divided between the language of populists, which is simplified, and the language of experts and politicians, which is too complicated. And I think that language, we should actually translate between English and English, Czech and Czech, Serbian and Serbian, because sometimes people from the same language speaking community can't understand each other. Just as like I felt that I can't understand you because you were talking about communism from a different perspective, even though I'm incredibly intrigued in your work and your experience and stories in Rojava or Mexico. Because of this COVID ergo Zoom situation, we have no live audience, but my colleagues prepared a short survey involving local people from Ji.hlava, so you can hear their answers to question, what revolution do you wish for? Well, the Velvet Revolution, not anymore, I think. So environmental revolution, I guess. Revolution of humanity, because we need that. I don't want any revolution to happen. Maybe revolution of our attitude to the environment. Education, because I think education is the basis. If we had educated population, there would be no problems. No revolution for me, please. Maybe some slow, gradual changes of a world towards a world that would be closer to my to my opinions. I don't know.
No a pokud dovolíte, tak já bych si dovolil půjčit si něco, co jste nám poslal.
I would like to borrow a text that you sent us. I read it, and what I understand is that if we looked at the world as capitalist world and we only took into considerations figures and numbers, we should take into consideration also the work of forests, which is not included in numbers, while it is absolutely crucial for us humans to breathe and exist. We incredibly underestimate the work done by rainforests, for instance. In this context, I have very basic reflection thought. If we wanted to invite you next year to Ji.hlava, you were available, would you go to Ji.hlava? How much would you like us to pay for the job done by forests? How much more expensive your flight ticket should be? To launch the subject of environmental revolution.
It is, but just to go back before that to the reactions of people who were, I'm in a certain sense, I was just thinking, listening to the reactions and thinking about them. Instinctively, but also theoretically, they made sense to me. I think that we are making a mistake when we talk about revolution with this capital R, right? We are kind of used to think about revolution in a certain way, the same way that we are trained to think about a society in a particular way. We tend to identify society with a nation state. And as I told you, my whole life has been a long struggle against this naturalization of the state as a normal way of organizing human life, or is the only way of organizing human life. Ortega and Gasset he has a beautiful term called orthopedic thinking, which is thinking that not only is discounting other forms of thinking, but actually doesn't allow their existence. And I think that we do suffer from a form of orthopedic thinking when it comes to revolution, when it comes to state. Society is not a state, and revolution is not the capturing of the instruments of the state, of a particular territory, of the whatever, White Castle or Winter Palace or whatever it is. These are old ways, I would say Jacobin ways inherited from the worst periods of the French Revolution that unfortunately shaped the modern liberal world. And disciplinarian Bolsheviks and all of that nonsense that we have to deal away with, we need to find a new language. And as you have seen, the problem of translational issues with communism is very interesting. New language has to reflect something that is not wedded to the notion of nation state, and transformation that we can call revolution or something else. Revolution with a small r, revolutionary action, something else. I'm completely open to different ideas that are more than anything else about the transformation of political common sense. Say, Immanuel Wallerstein, my old professor who died recently in the United States, he had this idea of world revolutions. And he said that 1968 was a world revolution, and so was 1848. The reason why there were world revolutions, not only because they were happening in many parts of the world at the same time, but because they transformed the political common sense, and certain things that were unimaginable before, even decades before, became common sense conversation in cafes or universities a few decades later. And this is what successful revolutions do. But let's stick to the territory and think about a revolution. You mentioned Rojava. Rojava is one of the few places in the world where it's the only place in the world, really, where I would be able to say what my grandparents spoke about when they were thinking of revolution is something that I received as a story. However, what I've experienced going to Rojava, which is in northeastern Syria, predominantly Kurdish, but not only Kurdish, actually is a revolution, a very genuine revolution. And this is the only revolution in more or less classical sense that I have ever experienced. That revolution is intimately linked to the idea of nature. Namely, the idea that they use is called social ecology. And the phrase that they use there is democratic modernity. And they insist that democratic modernity is built on this idea of environmental sustainability, women's liberation, and political organization that's not the state. There's a feminist author by the name of Maria Mies who gave what I still believe is one of the most beautiful definitions, elegant definitions of capitalism, which is the appropriation of women, nature, and colonies. And what people in Rojava are doing is creating a society that's based on liberation of women, liberation of nature, and liberation of politics. So they have created a system of directly democratic governance of that they call democratic confederalism, where all decisions are made at the level of local councils, level of neighborhoods, level of villages, and level of cities. This confederation is not a state because there is no coercive power that exists separate from the population. When we went there, and it was an incredible trip, you have to go to Syria, you have first to Iraq, then you have to go more or less illegally from Iraq, which is the other area, Kurdish area. In Iraq, you have to somehow get to the Syrian part, which is known as Rojava, or the place, the West, the place where sun sets. And it's incredible. You are in the middle of a festival that's full of contradictions. You are in the middle of people truly building a new world. But again, as I was trying to explain with my notions of actually existing communism, there's nothing completely new about it. They have been building it for years, for decades. Since the emergence of the Kurdish freedom movement, they have been created these communal organizations on the ground in Syria. And when the war started, and when the Syrian troops, Assadists, the troops of the regimes, left the area, they were already organized. And they already took the opportunity and created, as far as I'm concerned, the only free society that I actually work on studying free society, the only actually free society that I've ever been to. And that doesn't mean it's free of contradictions, that doesn't mean it's free of imperfections, but it is a democratic, confederalist, alternative, a different political organization that's not a state organization. It has communal economy. It has extremely sophisticated thinking about the environment, environmental sustainability. It has a relationship to nature that is very peculiar and intriguing because it goes very much against this guy who is behind me, Descartes. Descartes and his Cartesian dualism between nature and humanity, or maybe nature and society, was one of these anchoring dualisms that completely shaped the way that we think, and it probably was the elementary dualism, after which all other dualisms were created. And the interesting thing about this is that there is no humanity versus nature separated from society, separated from nature when you go to Rojava. Or when you study at University of Rojava, where I used to teach while it was still possible, and where now I teach using Zoom. Humanity in nature and nature in humanity are an integrated whole. It's a very new and different civilizational way of thinking, of going beyond these old dualisms that were sort of pitting society versus nature, creating this divide, this dichotomy, this binary, very much in the service of accumulation of capital, an organization of the world that makes work, or makes us think about work in a particular way. My greatest problem with the way that we think about work is exactly your question. Namely, we don't count the work/energy of the biosphere. We don't count the work of nature. We get it for cheap, so to speak. So what happens really is that we have a wrong way of thinking about capitalism. And let me offer a different one. So if the conventional way of thinking about capitalism is just this endless growth, another way of thinking about capitalism is civilizational. It is a particular and peculiar, malignant organization of accumulation of power, accumulation of capital, and organization, production really of nature. And it exists, it can exist only through appropriation of unpaid labor. There are two forms of unpaid labor. One form of unpaid labor is the one that you asked about, and that's the free labor, unpaid labor of nature. The other form of work, of labor, that capitalism mobilizes and utilizes for free is unpaid labor of women. In feminist literature, there's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful analysis, one after another, of something that's called care work and care labor, unpaid work of women, and also in some places unpaid work of children and elderly, is something without which capitalism cannot survive. So capitalism really is a sort of an island of commodity exchange in the ocean of unpaid labor. So if we don't think about this trialectics of work as unpaid work of humans, unpaid work of nature, and waged work, we are not really able to understand what work or labor in capitalism is about. And capitalism, like any other civilization, is about organization and particular way of mobilizing work. So traveling to Ji.hlava, I would love to come next year. And my problem with the way that many environmentalists who mean really well is how they actually posit the problem. The problem is not flying. The problem, the flying, of course, is a problem in terms of the environmental damage, but it's not a solution. Not to fly is not a solution. We cannot shop our way out of this crisis. We cannot consume differently in order to stop this crisis. In order to stop the climate crisis, which is part of this larger crisis of capitalism, we have to create a new civilization. We have to create a completely new way, and in that sense, revolutionary way of thinking about life, thinking about work, and thinking about nature. We are not going to be able to change anything, or we were going to be able to change a little bit, but not too much. If we start doing here in Berkeley, for example, around me, there are urban farms. There are quite a few of them. You know, these are like urban people having chickens in their, you know, they've never been to a village, but they have chickens, they have whatever, and they're living a sort of a simulation of rural life. It's interesting, and I think people should do it, but that's not going to stop the climate change. That's not going to affect in any meaningful way the crisis that we are talking about. What we need to do is not to stop flying, but to find imaginative ways of replacing this system, which is really a civilization, which is really a way of thinking, with another one. And that other one should be based on utilizing what I think anarchists were talking about throughout, which is these elements of reasonability, of gift, of exchange and political organization that's least harmful. Capitalism doesn't give us, at this point at least, doesn't give us an option not to be revolutionary. I don't think we can afford it. Even if we don't want to be, in a certain sense, we have to be. Because there is going to be, and I know this sounds a little bit weird, and I know that people from all sides of political spectrum were predicting the end of capitalism for at least 500 years. However, it is coming to a point where capitalism cannot reproduce itself, and it cannot sustain itself, but it cannot produce and live off cheap nature and cheap work that capitalism is built on. So it's really time for us to unleash our imagination and do all of those things that capitalism is most afraid of, which is think differently, look at alternatives, look at other possible ways of life, and create something else. And that's why I was so attracted to Rojava and to what Kurds are doing in that part of Syria, because they are actually trying to create society that's based on completely different values. And I would definitely recommend everybody to find, and you can do it on YouTube, you can do it there are many books, there are many films, there are many people who went to Rojava and who left really important testimonies. And it's one of the projects that actually really needs our help, because right now, one of the most dangerous people in the world, Erdogan, president of Turkey, is bent on destroying the Kurdish experiment, and so is Assad. And so is every leader of every nation state, because this directly democratic model based on liberation of women and liberation of nature is an actual threat to every nation state in the region.
Our meeting is getting to a close, and maybe I will ask you one last question. We have been looking at this text behind you, Covido ergo sum. Do you think that there is a better way for us to think about the world now in the COVID era? We don't fly so much. You didn't fly here. You saved energy, your energy, and you got time to reflect on your research. I know you are giving lectures and dialogues at university. You are discussing things with your students. Do you have recommendations for us, filmmakers, how to think out of the box, how to approach filmmaking in a new way, maybe also in the COVID context, which changed stereotypes? How to change things, how to get rid of the old and start making films in a new way. Czech documentarist Karel Vachl says, let's hang pictures in a different way in Louvre. This picture should lay on the floor, and this other picture should be taken from the cellar to a completely new place. So how can we change the location of pictures, we filmmakers?
I love the question. And all of these things that you just mentioned make perfect sense to me. And I'm going to give you the answer that you're probably not expecting. We need to sleep more. One of the worst things about capitalism is that since the beginning, it was a relentless war against sleep, relentless war against dreams. And one of those things that really attracted me to Czech tradition was, as I think I mentioned to you, was the tradition of surrealism, the tradition of the marvelous, the tradition of trying to go beyond that dualism of wakefulness and sleep. And I think that there is that real that lies beneath. And I think that there is something very important there. We live in the time where our life is 24/7. We live in this relentless time of serialization, to quote Sartre, in which we're all assigned a time of a continuous activity. What this gives us, this COVID, is a time to pause, time to stop as much as we can, time to go back to that surrealist interruption of everyday life. The reason why capitalists are so afraid of sleep is because sleep is a form of communism. Dreaming, daydreaming, as a collective affair, as a collective that involves trust, because sleep does involve trust, mutual trust. It also involves an interruption from the working day. It also involves a moment when we can dream. It also involves the suspended time before falling asleep, when you're lying down and when you're waiting to fall asleep, and when you're listening to your dog or the neighbor's dog who is barking, and all of those nocturnal noises around you. That is the time of imagination. That is the time of the most productive time. But it is also the time that threatens, and this is why we are receiving now this barrage of, it's absolutely fantastic, of there is no time, there is no interruption, there is no pause, there is no time to rest. It is just this constant, frantic activity of the new technological culture. And we have to be very careful, because we have to find ways of interrupting it. We have to learn how to wait, this artful activity of waiting, of being patient, of listening to silence. I escaped my COVID cage here in Berkeley, and I went back home to my village in Croatia by the sea. And I was listening, I was at the bench. In the part, there's not a single human being was there. It's absolute silence. And I realized with utmost horror that I was terrified. I was terrified of silence. I was looking to fortunately, I left my cell phone back home. I was looking frantically for my cell phone. And it took me an hour to actually get used to that silence, to use to waiting, to use to these normal elements of human life. If there is anything that COVID can do, this particular manifestation, morbid manifestation of everything that's wrong with capitalism, which is this pandemic, it maybe can remind us that there are different temporalities, different rhythms, different ways, including sleep, of not only interrupting the reality of endless accumulation of both capital and images, but also of recovering through dreams and daydreams a sense of possibility which we can only do together and collectively in the way that is communistic.
Tak a to je nádherný konec.
That is a very beautiful final point to our sometimes politically charged debate. We finished by talking about surrealism, which is your favorite artistic movement, via also your interest in the group of Jan Schwankmajer, who says that all the power should go to imagination, which I think goes very well, goes hand in hand with your final point when you say that sleep is our space for dreaming, relaxation, and allowing ourselves to take a break and think differently than rationally, drawing on our subconsciousness, which allows us to relate to our other people in general and create something new. I think it was really great debate. Let us sleep more. Bill Gates recommends also. He wrote a bestseller on sleep. Probably he was also deprived of sleep. So let us keep in touch. Let us exchange ideas, because this is, after all, the objective of this forum and discussion. So, colleague, thank you again very much and hope to meet you in person in Ji.hlava. Goodbye.
Milí diváci, je mou milou povinností pozvat vás na inspirační fórum, které pokračuje.
To our viewers, I would like to invite you for tomorrow's discussion at 6:30 from Ji.hlava again. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.